self-actualization. And that's really what therapists do. We're interested in our fellow human beings. I think it's amazing that people tell me their life story because it's so different and unique each time. And I just get that wonderful feeling that this is awesome, that you're willing to tell me this. All right, so all right, so how does all of this build to the way that we actually train clinicians? So traditionally, the clinicians are trained under this, what's called a scholar practitioner model. And so the idea of this is that you have your theory, you have your research, you have your scholarship, but you need to also have this experiential knowledge. And this experiential knowledge is all about your values, your political commitments, your ethical conduct, who you are, right? And so it's been acknowledged for a really long time that we have this scholar practitioner model. You have knowledge, and then you have this practitioner aspect. So originally, this was designed to train clinical psychologists. It makes a lot of sense. It's been expanded now to be used in other kinds of trainings, including business, law, other kinds of health aspects. But I don't think that this truly captures everything about being a mental health counselor any longer. The scholar practitioner gathers the knowledge aspect and it gathers the interpersonal qualities, but then I think we need to think beyond that even to the actual clinical aspects, right? If someone in business is doing a scholar practitioner model, they're not thinking about clinical aspects of business, right? And so I think we need to make sure that we clarify that for folks. The model is originally one that's basically about the process of educating the individual, so how to be a good student, how to get the most knowledge, right? If we add in clinical, it keeps the educational qualities and the interpersonal qualities, but it focuses then that there is a clinical application of knowledge. So specifically, what are the symptoms of depression and bipolar disease and schizophrenia? How do they affect people? And the application of clinical skills. How do I do a systematic desensitization with the client? What's the actual words that I say, the process that I go through? And so I really think it should look more like this, that we have that scholarship knowledge, right? So this would be all of the general information that we need to know. Practitioner self-actualization, so I think we need to include the practitioner component, but we really need to amp it up. And I think it should be the central component. Everything else should come through that practitioner self-actualization. And then on the other end there, we have the clinical skill and clinical knowledge, which kind of go hand in hand. So we could do this even better since I hopefully convinced you that the therapist is the curative factor in therapy. Then that means that we want to train the therapist, the nature of the therapist, the person of the therapist. And so I think this can be done really well through a wellness model. So essentially, I think that there should be kind of 3 different levels here. The first level, you do some kind of self-assessment. We do some interventions to help you with growth, and then we relate that to theory. The next one, self-assessment, growth, and then we relate that to actual practice. And then we go to the next one, the clinical knowledge, and we relate that to the actual clinical aspects. So the way that this might look played out, so let's say in the first level, self-assessment, we might have students look at an assessment of values to consider in choosing their career path. And so this is from a already pre-printed value set. I just gave you a couple up there, and then you can see underneath all of that are still lots more. Independence, family relationships, interest, opportunities to serve people, adventure, inner harmony. And so students would look at what are their inner values. And so then the growth opportunity from this could be some kind of a reflection exercise, meditation. They could be going to a personal counselor themselves, could be discussion groups to talk about values, or even other kinds of wellness activities. And then once we've kind of introduced that this is the assessment of yourself, these are the ways that you can grow, then we want to tie it to theory. So at that point then, your values that you consider on a career path can have an impact on the ethics and the way that you're going to be working with clients, right? if you are one of those people that value a high income and you have a client that says, I can no longer pay you, right? What are you gonna do with that? That's gonna be a value judgment that's made based on your personal beliefs. So we have ethics, boundary violations, and even just human development. How do our values change over time? And then level 2, so then we're really looking at the practitioner aspect, right? So we're looking at that self aspect, the practitioner aspect. So this one in inventory might be something like, what are the characteristics of effective helpers? It could be personal traits. Which of the following do you consider to be the most important personal characteristic of a good helper? And you could list some different characteristics, leave that open. Fees, here's the one. If I was working with a client who could no longer pay me, I would most likely. What would you do in that situation? So we present this as an assessment. Then we have a growth opportunity. So these are practice sessions with working with clients, working with people pretending to be clients. This is the actual watching of therapy sessions. This might be personal counseling. So we have all of these activities that help people to grow. And the skills that we are learning throughout this process, that is active listening, empathy, purposeful and flexible boundaries, prompting, challenging, summarizing, just as a few. And so that's kind of that level. Then, when we go to the clinical level, again, I think we should do the assessment, the growth, and then the skills. So the assessment would be something like, how do your career values and beliefs about the helping process impact your clients? And so you might actually have the students that are talking about, well, I have this particular client, this is the way this probably impacts it. The growth opportunity, we want to learn about people here. So there's all kinds of ways you could do that. You could talk to people, you could read articles, you can do interviews with people, you can read biographies, right? We just want to get to know about people. And then from that, what we develop then in our skill set is learning the clinical symptoms, learning about multiculturalism and intersectionality, thinking about systematic influences, and really putting to work that biopsychosocial model. And so some examples of this all coming together, it might be something along the lines then of, how do your values and beliefs impact your work with a 30-year-old cisgender female with anxiety versus working with a Black 18-year-old transgender male to female individual with depression versus working with a multiracial family that's going through a divorce, right? These are all the ways that we have to put these together. And so that would be more of that clinical aspect. So again, all of this, I hope, is bringing you back to the idea that the therapist is in fact the technique. You can't learn to do counseling. You have to learn to be a counselor. And so I had that in each of my 3 areas here. These are some of my references. And do you have questions for me? Yes?
All right, let me pull my note back up again. 1 second, moment. What was interesting, actually, what was my question here in this front? So, I was really interested in what you're talking about, the therapist kind of being that key ingredient to the therapy in this case.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess one of my questions was kind of like branching off of that then to a certain degree. If the counselor is kind of that key ingredient in that case, but they're learning kind of these therapy sessions,
Mm-hmm.
and like you mentioned going to therapy as a counselor basically to help kind of actualize that and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk about that a little bit more, like how that kind of rolls together, kind of like as educators, sometimes like we go and watch another presentation, something like that, to take those kind of notes. How does that kind of factor into that kind of self-actualization of a therapist?
So it might be something along the lines of, let's say that you're doing work on your values assessment, right? And so you do have your top 3 values, and then when you're in counseling, you're talking to your personal counselor about this values assessment that you did, and you start to go, but it really surprised me why I didn't have autonomy as higher. And so then you'd actually work through the therapy session about like, well, what contributed to that? What were your messages about autonomy you got growing up? And then in that therapy session, you could decide that you wanted to alter the way in which you deal with factors of autonomy. And then that's going to be brought to your other clients, right? Your clients, because then how are you going to deal with your clients who are saying, I can't control anything in my life, right? And if your views on autonomy are about this, that's how it applies. So does that kind of get at what you were asking?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a follow-up question, but I don't want to hog all the space too. Thank you.
One short question and then a comment. The short question is hypochondria now a mental disorder?
Yes, it's actually called illness anxiety disorder.
Okay, that's one. And the second is more of a comment. I'm teaching ethics of communication, so a lot of what you're talking about here resonates with dialogical ethics, kind of developing a relationship through dialogue, right? And one of the central figures there is, surprise, surprise, called Rogers, right? Rogerian therapy. So I'm wondering if this can be kind of built into your communicative aspect, where you are developing listening skills and viewing skills and all of that, and kind of like the idea that, and that actually plays into the idea of therapist as the technique, that you are healing another person through the dialogue and through constant communication.
Yeah, and absolutely. So Rogerian theory in the counseling world, we consider that to be basically the quintessential theory that underlies all the other theories.
Right.
Right.
Unconditional positive regard and all of that.
Yeah, and so it is this idea of you learn what is unconditional positive regard, what is empathy, what is trust and things like that, and then you learn it, but then you also experience it so that you're able then to give that to your clients. Yeah, because then we do want to be able to create an atmosphere where there's unconditional positive regard. And all of us as human beings, we have biases, right? And so to actually be looking at those biases and then feel like you're going into the therapy room kind of stripped of that is a real process. Right.
So I can imagine when you're talking with psychology students in the counseling track or the counseling students, you have an audience that is open to this sort of thought process. How did this go with the PA students?
As far as I know, they love it. I know that they were a little nervous because they were going, oh my gosh, this is 2 credits. How do we get all this done? But they seem to really have liked it.
Good.
Yeah, and I try to emphasize at the beginning, like, you will have better diagnoses, you will have better patient outcomes if you do these skills.
Good.
Sean?
So kind of like this other aspect that's kind of interesting to me. You also stress like the idea of like humanness, like being relatable, building that rapport, especially as a therapist in this case. Like your own human capacity is part of the cure, more or less, in this case.
Absolutely.
And it's interesting because like I've heard it expressed in the past that like counselors are supposed to be like more removed, more aloof, not like as interpersonal out front, which is a similar kind of thing that sometimes gets said about doctors, PAs, educators, even like student success employees on that front.
So
kind of like
from the psychoanalytic theory of counseling, which was developed by Freud, it was based on a medical model to begin with.
Okay.
And Freud was very concerned about psychology not being taken seriously, and so he only wanted to limit it to what we could test scientifically. And so that's the tradition that comes from this idea of being aloof and removed, because Freud was teaching it as you didn't want to bias the client in any way, right? He was looking at this as more research, we're gathering this knowledge, and so I don't want to input anything into there. Now that we've had several different waves of therapy, including the multicultural wave and things like that, and the humanistic wave, it's really much viewed today that you have to have that human interaction. You can't be a blank slate.
Okay.
Because the person's you're not getting the full person then.
So on that same model then, I've also heard it said that, for instance, counselors shouldn't give any advice or anything like that. You're supposed to just ask questions and have the person answer the questions for yourself. Is that more the older style, or how's that playing out?
That very much plays out currently. I actually tell all of my students that. In micro-counseling skills, that's probably the biggest feedback as I stop giving advice.
Yeah.
And the reason being, advice isn't really that useful. And with advice, you're probably wrong, right? If I'm just telling you, hey, Sean, this is what you should do, right? That ends that interaction. Rather than me sitting down with you and saying, Sean, what's going on? What have you tried? What haven't you tried? What do you think might happen if you do try? That's different than just the advice giving.
Okay.
So, So,
So it's kind of like a balance between those 2 points, between not like just giving your opinion on things, but also like just forming that dialogue and interpersonal aspects.
yes, and that is why my therapists are my students are most frustrated by me, because they will ask me a question and I'll say, yes, and. But yeah.
On the cure versus heal
Mhm.
modality, and then it seemed like there was also like another kind of 2x2 of disease and, well, let's say health, I guess.
Mhm.
Is there a possibility for a third category? So there's like disease, there's health, but then even wellness, I guess. Like not just disease or health is the absence of disease, but actually feeling good, I suppose.
Yeah, and so a little bit of that gets into the divide between counseling and psychology. So psychology has traditionally seen it as more of a healing, right? That there's this aspect of something that's going on, and I'm sorry, it's a curing. There's this aspect, and we fix it. Counseling basically has said that wellness is the absence of disease, right? And see it as more of a process than a state. And so that would be the difference there, is counselors are more of they look at it and say, what's the problem that's going on? What strengths do you have? How can we do this from a wellness perspective? Whereas psychologists might be more likely to say, this is the disease you have, this is how we treat it. So yeah, I think there's room for that third category, but I think it also falls along the distinction between, in the field between counseling and psychology.
Thanks.
All right, I don't see any other hands.
I'm wondering one thing.
Okay.
What happens with the PAs now when they actually get into, a hospital situation or something like that, and they're told that they only have a certain amount of time with which to work with the patients? So there's no time for some of this.
So you have to learn these skills, and you have to learn them very well. I can probably, at this point, form a good rapport with a client within the first 3 minutes. So you can get faster. And then the better you are at forming that initial rapport, the more accurate the information is, so it doesn't necessarily take you longer, right? So you're right, yeah, a lot of times they're struggling, but they got 15 or 20 minutes with a person. You can get a lot of information in that time if you start on the ground running, already having those good relationship skills in place. Yeah. And that's something like, obviously at the beginning, when I was started off in counseling, we'd give an hour for an assessment, and I'd still be late in the evening trying to finish it. And now I'm like, oh yeah, I can totally get this done. All right, well, thank you very much. You were very attentive.
I really am grateful to Shannon. The last minute, we found out that Professor Amor wasn't able to come, so she really came right in here and gave us some wonderful information, so thank you for doing that. We'll have our final Thiel Forum Special Edition next Thursday, March 30th, and Michelle Lentz will deliver part 2 of her Teaching with Technology, and Dr. Sheila Gross and her students involved with the lecture will discuss that student publication and request a call for editors and submissions. So thank you for your support of the Thiel Forums this year. This is our last technical Thiel Forum, but enjoy the rest of the semester and enjoy the summer. But I'll see you next Thursday, I hope, at the special edition. All right, take some refreshments on your way home. Thank you again.